So let's start. Thank you so much. Welcome. This is HKCAN. I'm Yvonne, your host today. Today we normally speak in Cantonese, but today we have a very special guest. He's our longtime Hong Kong U professor in law, Michael. He's going to be with us in a panel. So we have to switch channel from Cantonese to English. So I hope you don't mind. And so I want to talk about what we're going to discuss today. And first of all, if you haven't seen us before, we're HKCAN, Hong Kong Collaborative Academic Network. We're an online community that's composed of a critical mass of researchers, scholars, and educators who are who focus on helping young people from Hong Kong academically. And also today we're going to talk about the issue. It's really, we're saddened by the war, the unjust invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And this is something that we find it completely senseless, and we try to get together and talk to experts, try to make sense of something that says completely make no sense to us. So making sense of senselessness. So it's our goal today. And we also want to learn from the panel that whether we can do something about to stop this war collectively as a grassroots. So this is it. I want to turn the panel to our guests, and they will talk about their background and introduce themselves quickly. So I want to turn the time to Samuel, because we also have Samuel and Vincent. So Samuel, would you be able to talk about your professional background, your area of expertise, and say hi?
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you for having me, and thank you. It's great to join Dr. Vincent and Michael, who's been someone that I've worked closely with now for the last 3 years, and admire and learn from a lot. I joke with him that I'm the only person from Hong Kong who has not been a student in his classes over the decades, but I feel like I've gotten a firsthand education working with him. But a little bit about my background. So most recently, I think some of you might be aware that I have been helping to organize the U.S. American response to the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and what has taken place as far as the erosion of the basic freedoms and autonomy in Hong Kong. And so I come at this conversations partially as essentially the political organizer, the strategist around how policies are made and how diplomatic and foreign policies are made in the particular American political process. And how people can make impact, right? Have influence over how government act on their behalf as their representative in these matters. The other, looking back a little bit further back, I previously have worked on mostly domestic political issues. I was a political strategist and an organizer here in the US. I worked on domestic issues, but from a perspective that is very much based on religious traditions. I spent a decade as the national organizer for a Jewish nonprofit. And so sort of this idea of social justice was sort of the foundation of my work in particularly addressing poverty issues here in the US. And then prior to that, I worked on the campaign that legalized same-sex marriage. Again, it's very similar in nature to the combinations of how to look at social justice from a perspective of various religious traditions, but also the small d democratic traditions in the US. And so I'm not an academic like most, like you guys are, but I have a degree in theology from Fuller Seminary in ethics, actually, and I study partly, actually, interestingly enough, just war theories in seminary, and then my undergrad degree is actually in American politics, and so I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, Samuel. You're highly qualified to comment on this issue. We would love to learn from you. Don't say that you're not academic, and academic in this if they're not in this area, we won't be able to contribute any knowledge. So next one, Mike, our professor, Professor Mike. You're still muted. Sorry.
My daughter told me to be mute in case the dogs bark. so I muted myself, and then of course I forgot to turn it back on. In any case, you already said that. I've been a professor in Hong Kong actually for over 30 years. I taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong first, and then the University of Hong Kong. So my career is focused on human rights. I teach international human rights. I've taught also in Hong Kong a comparative constitutional law, which sort of looks at the basic law and all of that. I wrote a book on it many years ago, and then recently another book called Making Hong Kong China. And that book is right now on the market. And so that's what I do. I think more or less functioning as a public intellectual in Hong Kong, because the topics I deal with have always been very sensitive in Hong Kong. So I've been in the media so many times. At one time even was one of the organizers of what was called the Article 23 Concern Group, which led the protest in 2003 against the proposals then for national security laws. So this is the kind of thing I do, and I pay attention to it. Of course, I'm paying attention a lot this last couple of weeks to Ukraine and what China's policies are on that as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we would love to learn from you about the what China is planning to do as well.
Yeah.
So we save it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Michael. And Dr. Vincent is been to our channel before.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your background?
Okay, sure. I keep it brief because it can be really long introduction. It's not good. I came to UK last year in August last year. Beforehand, I has been an assistant professor in the Department of Government and International Study at Hong Kong Baptist University from 2010 to 2018. During that time, I also served as the union leaders of the Hong Kong Baptist Faculty and Staff Union. In terms of the topic in relation to the justice, my very deep experience of observations can be related to how to strive for the interests of our academic and professional staff during the course with negotiating with the top managers, or even how to deal with the unreasonable policy making during the course. But of course, I'm also, I would say I also one of the loser of this, because I was forced to leave or depart from the Hong Kong BU in 2018. And then in the next 3 years, serving as a part-time teacher, also at the same time, also have been engaged in the YouTube online programs that using the online program to let people know about Hong Kong the problems, social problem or social injustice, especially in education sector. But with the passing of the national security law in July 2020, the situation changed dramatically. And I found it really difficult for me to express myself freely without fear, or even a number of associations related to the possibilities of the commentator to be arrested in the ground on national security law. That's the reason why I applied for the BNO visa in January last year, and then I decided to move to the UK in August last year. And excuse me, right now I stay in UK for over a half year. Learning a lot during the course, especially as you have mentioned that how Hong Kong people in UK actually support the people in the Ukraine, or even how to support them by organizing the donations event, money donation of the materials. And I do know that some friends in Indian also came to the boundary of between the Poland and Ukraine, so that they want to record what actually happened and let us know what actually happened.
We will ask you about this in detail in a moment.
Sure.
So yeah, we would love to hear about what the UK people the EU is doing.
Yeah.
So let's go straight to the heart of the issue right now. So today's topic is searching for justice. So before we talk about how to search for justice, I would love to hear from you, you guys, about how to conceptualize justice in terms of the economic or human rights or legal aspect, or religion aspect. Is there any justice defined in of course it is defined in religion as well, and social political science area. How do you guys conceptualize it? So maybe we let Samuel to talk about that first. Oh, sorry, you're muted too.
Yeah, I always get to start. I don't know why, but
sorry. I will switch the order.
Yes, no, it's okay. So let me just maybe post a few questions, because I would love to hear what Dr. Vincent and Dr. Davis really, I think their perspective, and make this more of a conversations. So I operate in a little bit of an interesting intersection, because I operate both as a justice in a very sort of moral, religious tradition, but also a democratic political tradition, right? So I want to pose a couple questions for people to kind of think about this, is that, you know, a lot of this has been making sense of politically, you know, there's been a lot of talk about disinformation, right? About the narrative of the basis of why Russia in particular is doing what it has invaded and taken this war. You can look at it as a disinformation, or really what you're looking at is this moral justification, right? That what, you know, Vladimir Putin is doing through quote unquote what we perceive to be disinformation is really a justification, and in a lot of ways a moral justification for what their action would be. That is their basis for war, is that they are being threatened. And we, from the, you know, our perspective, see it as sort of like this weird, you know, this information doesn't make any sense. And why is he talking about Nazis? And why is he talking about, you know, invisible, you know, nationalist army that is fighting them? But the idea here is that there is a moral dimension that is almost necessitates these kind of stories and fake evidence in order for there to be justification. And so if you see that, I think that's an interesting and important look to see that there's justification of what is a just war and what necessitate the action that they have taken. And I think so that's one way to, I think, one dimension to justice that you have to look at. The other, I think is interesting, is that people always have this feeling of like, we really want the US or the EU or people who are on the right side to take action, right? And we always equated as that, you know, just like Russia has this campaign to give basis to their action, we have this sort of uncontrolled, sometimes sort of this almost unsatiable desire for quote unquote justice to be done in a way that is more of a retribution to things that we have seen done. And And it creates a very strong frustration, right? That people say, well, why can't we do this? Why can't we just send troops?
Stop
You know,
it.
why can't we
Just send troops.
yeah, why can't we do a no-fly zone? You know, why can't, but we also have to understand that there's a dimension to justice in politics, right? Particularly in Western liberal democracies, that says that we have to do good for the most amount of people. And in some way, that's the justification of making decisions and policies as far as saying that we're not going to trigger this invisible line of potential World War III and nuclear war with a nuclear power, because there is a calculation of, even in the greatest suffering of what we see from the people of Ukraine, that we're not going to trade that or see that as equate to potential suffering of a nuclear conflict.
Even more people will be in.
Yeah. And so I think
suffering,
I just want to post those kind of two examples that I think thinking about in this particular conversations about justice from a perspective of policymaking and political process, but also as a way of thinking about the moral justification of Russia saying that, this is where we are threatened existentially, and making up those evidence to justify it. And I would close with this, my opening comments with this is that, I think that you see a very unique moment right now, because one of the reasons why Ukraine has gotten so much support is because they have also created a moral justification of existence, right? A basic value of saying that we're not going to surrender and that we're going to protect our sovereignty and land. And that's actually not how modern governments generally negotiate wars, right? Modern politics and foreign policy generally comes from this place of compromise and negotiation. And you're still seeing that tension right where I think Ukraine is, right? People look at Zelensky, President Zelensky, and say, he's such a hero, he's not giving an inch, he's actually the moral conscience and leaders for the free world. But at the same time, you see he's also thinking about, what is the negotiation point? What are we willing to talk about in terms of as a government, as a state? It might not make political sense to get to the very end where everybody in Ukraine is killed and where everything is destroyed in Ukraine. So I think that those tensions, as far as I think the idea of justice in the political arena and the policy arena versus the justice in a moral religious sense, I think it's an interesting dynamic. So I'll stop there, because I would love to hear what Dr. Benson and Dr. Davis have to say.
Yeah. And I think the next one is Michael, Professor Michael.
Yes. Well, I agree with what Samuel's saying. And so, what he talks about in the religious and political tradition, of course, Ukraine would come under something called just war theories, and both sides are trying to argue that. And there's a deep philosophical tradition arguing about what is or is not a just war. And I think Samuel has interrogated it pretty well. I think a lot of people in Hong Kong, because of Hong Kong's tradition of the rule of law, and Hong Kong was often rated among the top in the world when it comes to the rule of law. So Hong Kong people also associate justice with law, with the rule of law. Yeah, and the idea that you have checks and balances on government behavior, and that people, populist leaders can't just do whatever they want. I mean, many people will know there is a debate like that in the United States when Trump was in power. It's a kind of populism that may dismiss or give low regard to constraints that, the populist leader is elected to do what he wants. We see that in Duterte in the Philippines, and now the son of Marcos making similar arguments to get elected and do whatever they want. And of course, Putin is very much in that tradition. He's elected repeatedly, and he feels that he can do what he wants. So he starts to develop a kind of illiberal tradition, what we call an illiberal tradition, that disregards the constraints. And when that happens, what we're seeing is what happens as a result. So I think the legal element of, and in the international level, we know the UN Charter says that you would not attack another country, a sovereign power. Under Article 51, you only use force in self-defense. So all of that is being ignored in this case. And that brings another dimension that Samuel didn't mention, and not beyond the legal one, is historical one. I think one of the things we can say about Ukraine is it looks very familiar to Chinese people. It's a kind of a traditional imperial power. Putin, before he attacks, he makes a speech lodging what he's doing in history, that Ukraine is not really a state. And of course, everybody in Asia is thinking Taiwan, and so he's going into this with a kind of, I think his speech was more than anything else directed at Beijing. He's kind of saying, yeah, Ukraine is like your Taiwan. So what we're doing is completely legitimate. We're recovering historical territory. And if you actually look at the history of the treatment of Ukraine as first its own country, much like, say, Tibet, for example, that had its own historical tradition and independence. And then it's brought into the Soviet Union as a kind of empire. And Stalin, apparently, like Mao, had a period of extreme behavior where millions of Ukrainians were killed. And so the Ukrainians have a rather bitter history with Russia. But what we see in this historical narrative and this populist narrative is a kind of disregard of all of that. And so Beijing is put at a kind of dilemma. On the one hand, it's always speaking up against any intrusion into sovereignty, usually meaning its sovereignty.
Their own sovereignty.
Yeah, its own sovereignty, which it includes Taiwan as a component of. And at the same time, it recognized the sovereignty of Ukraine. In fact, had very large relationship with Ukraine, using Ukraine as a kind of entree into Europe. And so what does it do? So that's why Putin has to make the speech. Well, Ukraine really wasn't a separate country. And then we know, of course, in this narrative that China and Russia are kind of aligning themselves. And this is where the first part of my presentation comes in. That is this liberal democracy and the rule of law versus a kind of autocratic state, ruled by some kind of leader who can do pretty much what he wants. And so they've aligned themselves, and they've done things like try to define their countries as democracies and such, a people's democracy and so on. So that alignment is threatened by a very uncomfortable position that Beijing finds itself in. And for the Ukrainian people, this poses a real problem. Now, they've sought justice at the international level. They've filed a case in the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention, where they claim that the Genocide Convention, while it doesn't have a human rights kind of committee like other human rights treaties, it calls for a dispute resolution. And so they filed the case, and Russia, I've seen its brief, of course, like China did in the South China Sea case, it argues, well, there's no jurisdiction, because neither Ukraine or Russia have conceded generally to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So they did that. And the other avenue is the International Criminal Court under what's called the Rome Statute. Ukraine is not a party to the Rome Statute, neither is Russia, but Ukraine issued an authorization in 2014 that the jurisdiction would be open for the International Criminal Court and prosecutions under the Rome Statute, and requested investigation because in 2014, the pro-Russian government had done some things that they questioned. Well, the ICC prosecutor is actually carrying out an investigation. Some 39 countries ask him to do so. And so the question of justice in a very legal sense is on the table. Of course, Russia will contest this jurisdiction as well. But at this moment, the prosecutor has upped the ante and said he's going to conduct a full-scale investigation of Russia's behavior. So all sorts of kinds of justice taking place here. And I'll leave it at that for further discussion.
I loved all these points you brought up. And ICC would be International Criminal Courts.
Yes.
In International Criminal Court.
Yes.
So and now we wanted to hear from Dr. Vincent, from your political science point of view and the study of power. What do you see? What justice is for you in your professional opinion?
I see. So I recall, and when I taught the course about political and social movement some years ago, there is a field we call cultural framing. In other words, how people can establish the understanding of justice is based on their conditions, their knowledge about what is justice. But however, I emphasize that in most cases, people understand injustice, social injustice.
Yes.
Regardless, discrimination, exclusion, marginalizations, or even a number of issues about social justice like capitalism, just like what we call almost over 10 years ago about the 91% of the poor people, 1% rich people that was that occupied Wall Street. So from what Iwan had said, from the very theoretical conceptual understanding about justice is actually how we establish the understanding about this concept. The second issue, of course, is how the story is to be told so that the story can be with affection. Because when we talk about justice, of course, just like the academic, we can discuss it in a really academic, professional, rational sense. But for the ordinary people, they feel very angry about those who have suffered from the injustice situation. Just like the people in UK, or even me, are willing to make money donation to the people who are in need, or even I know some labor of our community also initial themselves and ask people to give donation of like the food, the dress, or even some necessary
medical
goods.
supplies. And
then they take a flight to Poland and go to the boundaries of between Poland and Ukraine to help the refugees, doing something very concrete that how to help them. So you guys still remember when we just before kick off today's program, we have said how to make justice to be accessible and people can do something for it. Of course, just like 1 or 2 days ago, like in UK, there's for soldiers, they decided to join the international army supporting Ukraine's army. But of course, the London government will say no. Otherwise, if you're going to do this kind of thing, you will be punished or prosecuted after returning to the UK. But this is quite controversial because we do realize that when we understand justice, whether this is only a kind of issue from the really idealistic, perhaps really conceptual aspect, or well, when we talk about justice, this is right, but we also be realistic to consider the consequences of what you have done, like you directly send a tool to support Ukraine, or even you have to do something over Russia or even Putin's in terms of military actions, and maybe the Putin would drive crazy and doing something like they will have a nuclear war to be launched and everything will be over. So we can say something from the idealistic way, but at the end we still need to return to the realistic situation.
Right.
Just like the justice had to make this can. in this regard. So maybe I sum up what I'm saying. The first, people understand justice usually from the experience, personal or collective experience of being discriminated, being marginalized or excluded.
Yeah.
Second, when we understand justice, people usually they would think about they have to do something right, how to help the people who are in need, or even how to help the people who may be suffered from that situation, so that their situation would be more comfortable in some way, as in the capacity of ordinary people. And lastly, of course, whether justice had to be calculative in terms of the international realism, the great power politics, and a number of calculations, so that
economic interests of the big country,
so that maybe justice may not be the things that you think or advocate. That's all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Like it's really, you touch on many issues that an ordinary people thought about. We only thought about our own right, like a moral justice or procedural justice, that we have access to the legal system equitably, or, you know, things like that. That's our ordinary people conceptualization of justice. And then you touch on that, like it's really useful for us to think about the concept. So let's move on to the next questions, because the war right now is unfolding in front of us, and the world is just watching. While there's a lot of grassroots organized support to Ukraine, and I wanted to learn about the international law system. The Michael mentioned about the ICC, the International Criminal Courts, and then how does the international legal process work? How long does it take for the court to be able to prosecute the person who violates international human rights law or war crime offender? Like, how does it work, and who will be doing it, and when can it be done? I want Michael, your opinion.
I would guess I was the target of that question. Any case, you know, the International Criminal Court itself, we should appreciate, is a rather extraordinary thing. At the end of World War II, there was question about how to hold Japanese and German leaders accountable. And some trials were conducted in Tokyo of the leaders. And the same in Germany, the so-called Nuremberg trials, and some were held accountable. And so then that was it. There was some Yugoslav tribunals after that, where they would set up tribunals for specific conflicts. And so when the proposal for the International Criminal Court was made, it was kind of surprising to most of us who study human rights that the world would actually agree to this. But they did, and they created it under something called the Rome Statute. And this statute lays out the process by which prosecutions occur. But one of the problems it's had in the years up until now is that a lot of major powers have not agreed to the Rome Statute, and their leaders are not held accountable. And then a lot of developing countries in the South have been the subject of trials, as there's a kind of criticism that the North is putting the South on trial. So this is a question of justice, whether it's fair in the way it's handled. So this case now involving Ukraine is kind of special in a way, because it involves two countries in the North, both the victim population and the perpetrator is in the North. This is the dog I told you about. So what would happen is normally, to get a case before the court, the country has to be a party to the statute. That is the treaty. They have to sign on, and neither Ukraine nor Russia have signed on to it. So that raises the question, can you get jurisdiction? Well, one way to get it would be that the UN Security Council can bring a case to the court by vote of the Security Council, except the problem there is Russia is a permanent member with a veto power. So the Security Council is not going to do it. Russia would veto it. And so what happened is Ukraine, as I mentioned in 2014, said that it would open up its territory for an ICC investigation of what took place then, back just prior to when Russia took Crimea. And that was first open for a limited period, and then they agreed again to open it indefinitely. And so that still applies. So then the idea is there's a third way countries could be held accountable, and that is if they operate and violate the Rome Statute on the territory that is subject to the Rome Statute. That is, if they go into a country that has signed it, then even though their country has not, the actions they take could be subject to the reach of the court. And so this is what's going on now. That in fact, Ukraine made a complaint, and the prosecutor could not go to the Security Council. He knew that wouldn't work. The judges of the court have been reluctant to take that on their own. And so I think it was 39 countries agreed to do something about it. And so the case is now under investigation. Of course, Russia will object to the jurisdiction. And this is going to be a long process if it works at all, because Russia is not a party. It will not turn over Putin to the International Criminal Court. And any Russian soldiers will probably not be turned over to the court. And so then it would depend. Probably the only way Putin could be held to account would be if he is overthrown in Russia, and then he himself, they want to get rid of him. There's a principle that says that first, the most desired thing is to try the person in the country itself. Yeah. And you only take it to the court if that fails. So you can see it's a very complicated roadmap to try to get jurisdiction. And it could be years before anything happens. So this brings us to a point that I think is important, and I won't go on much further. Right. And that is publicity. A lot of accountability when it comes to the international human rights violations in countries that do not uphold human rights sufficiently is publicity. So even bringing the investigation itself is a form of justice. It's bringing to public attention what these individuals have done and shining a light on it, much as we do, as community groups do, as we're doing right now in talking about it. So a lot of international human rights enforcement, frankly, relies on publicity. When I teach human rights, that's probably my first class of this semester, to highlight all the obstacles to enforcement, but yet not to despair that there's a lot of ways. Organizations like Human Rights Watch, they've issued reports on this. This prosecutor has made statements about it. These 39 countries are bringing it up. The UN General Assembly even had an open debate and issued a resolution against Russia. So there's a lot of that going on. And maybe somewhere down the road, individuals could be held accountable under some circumstance.
Yeah, I love that. Like it's everybody's issue. Human rights is everybody's issue. Yes. It's not just the big countries or the international criminal court issues. Yeah. Every citizen who doesn't oppose to human rights has a responsibility to bring it up and to uphold the value of it. So I love that. So I wanted to hear from Dr. Vincent, the political science point of view, because right now it sounds like there's a lot of economic sanctions going on, and big corporations are pulling out from Russia, and their money is like going really down at least 40–50% of value already. So what do you think where it's going to, where it's going to, what is the next steps? And then what would you see in terms of the economic sanctions, and what else the big countries or strong major economies in the globe would do to stop Putin next step, and then what are the European Union, the EU is doing right now?
In terms of economic sanctions, usually people will regard this as a last resort before taking direct action, that is launching the war. But of course, economic sanction is a kind of ways or instrument that may have mutual hurt, just like the example of natural gas or even the oil, and in UK, the prices of oil is getting higher and higher, and ordinary people are supposed to understand the consequence in case the country or even the government decided to take up a very economic sanction towards this towards Russia. Especially, it will also terminate all of the purchase of oil from the Russia as well. So very something practical. The second aspect is a number of observations has found that Putin may not be care about economic sanctions, because the very first instant is not to take care of the national economy, but only his own poverty.
His own power.
Own poverty, the women, the children, the poverty overseas, blah, blah, blah. So in this context, even though you may looking back, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, US actually exercised the economic sanctions towards Russia, but it cannot make any significant changes over the Putin towards his aggressive behavior. Yeah. So and also the Western power also had to consider the consequences arising from the economic sanctions, just like the example of oil, the natural gas. In UK, everybody check their electronic bill. They found that the chart is getting higher and higher, but of course, people generally accept that price getting up because of that reason, because we have to terminate all the reliance or even dependency from Soviet Union over the natural gas. The second question that you have mentioned is when I think about the consideration of great power, of course, because this is not a similar situation in 1930s or 1940s, that the national leaders or even the politicians are really committed to launch a so-called just war to deal with the current issue of problem, like the aggressions of Russia or even China. Especially after the pandemic, they also have to consider a number of critical issues like economic recovery, or even the inflation, or even whether the global economy will be fluctuated because of the regional unrest. So there are some of consideration before thinking of a so-called direct action or direct interventions. And also they, of course, another aspect, the first aspect is that kind of political and economic relations. Just like 2 days ago, because a number of rich people or even the rich in Russia also support the soccer team in the UK, and the government decided to say, well, all of these the money support or even the aid had to be terminated, and those kind of soccer team will be affected immediately. That also arouse a kind of arouse of kinds of opinion that whether the government should reconsider that kind of measure toward the Russia. So the way is not the same as the 20th century, that with the terminate offing and impose the pressure, and the enemy will stop, enemy will calculate what's it about. In 2022, we have found a number of economic, political, hidden relationship, collaboration are in place. And what the government decided to do would also affect not only the Russia, but also the interests of the countries.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, this is like a puzzle us a lot. We look at the news. We thought that, oh, okay, so all these big countries impose all these sanctions. It must be doing something to stop Putin, or at least to arouse the people of Russia to be discontent or overthrown, even have a possibility of overthrowing the government. But looks like what you said, they don't care. Like, I mean, and people are powerless. Is that what you suggesting in Russia?
You talk about the people in Russia. I really appreciate those people who are there enough to go to the street and say no to Putin about the military aggressions. And also because the mass media is under the state control, so that most people only receive a one-sided information, justifying that this is a just war of Russia towards the Ukraine, and because Russia is under the national security threat because the extension of NATO, and also the US at the best stage. But at least we were able to observe that people in Russia, they're willing to come to say no to Putin. And also a number of observations have showed that no one knows when Putin can sustain himself for such a long time in the current military action. One example is right now, 35% of military forces is now in Ukraine. In the capacity of Russia, which is not normal, which is not acceptable, because based on the calculation of Putin, they were supposed to be a very quick war to finish the war with a very short period of time, but this is not the case.
Right.
So a number of wrong estimation from Putin has been told by so many commentators, wrong estimation of the reaction of Western world and also public opinion, wrong estimation of the people in Ukraine strongly resisting the aggressions of the Soviet Union, and also overestimate the military capacity of Russia in undergoing the military action. So let's see what's going on based on these three aspects.
Sure. So yeah, I want to leave the time for Samuel as well. We want to hear from him about the religion point of view. So from your point of view, from your Christian faith, how would you see the human rights problem in this war crime? Because we see like children being bombed and the bodies of children everywhere. Many people are being displaced from their home. Casualties every day is like going up. So what do you see this from a religion point of view? And can church be a source of power to come in and help with this issue?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate, I think, this is actually an interesting concept. So I would speak probably not just from a Christian, but just from a general sort of religious traditions, particularly in the Judeo-Christian, including the Jewish and the Christian perspective.
Yes.
Michael brought up, obviously his expertise is in court. It's actually interesting that biblically, in the Judeo-Christian perspective, justice, one of the most concrete way that justice is defined or manifests itself in the biblical traditions is in the courts. In the Hebrew scripture, it talks about the concept of God sort of the mandate or demanding that courts are set up at different parts of cities and locations to ensure that people have access to a system of justice. That includes both procedural justice in terms of making sure that every person have access to the court, and that there are procedures to make sure that people are not discriminated against because of their, level of economic status or whatever it might be. And then there are like substantive justice that is also mandated to say that those courts must not receive bribes, that there has to be certain justice value that are upheld by those. And that was really, I think, an important part of how people, particularly in the Judeo-Christian traditions, conceptualize the idea of justice, right? The other really important way that Judeo-Christian traditions define justice has to do with the idea of covenant. The idea that we make a commitment, we have this relationships, and that in itself is, I think, those two things still very much drive the way we think about contemporary conflicts. The fact that we have these judicatory sort of this jurisdictions, ideas of the international courts, of standard of sort of behavior, what is acceptable in armed conflicts, and what Michael talked about historically about the courts after World War II and other ethnic conflicts, and this idea that we also have this concept of the limitation of procedure when it comes to humanitarian and sort of the moral reaction that people have to conflict like Ukraine. And I think that here's where I would say that some of the connection between Hong Kong and other movement is that fundamentally there is a sense that there's a broken covenant in this case, right? That in Hong Kong, it was a joint declaration and the Sino-British where China entered into a covenant in a way, in a sense, of they have some obligations that they had entered into and that the world and British and Hong Kong people are part of. And breaking that covenant gives sort of this ground for right, just actions in response. Similarly, you see this in what Michael described as sort of the historical context, right? That the agreement that were made to Ukraine in the Budapest Treaty, the agreement to say that you are a sovereign country and that you have these exchange to say that you give up your nuclear arsenal and we maintain and grant you sovereignty and state, this idea of being able to follow and live under that covenant and breaking those, I think, gives ground for a response that you saw in Hong Kong, not only from the people who felt like that they have been mistreated and that they have been cheated out of their rights and what has been promised to them, but you also see that there's a global understanding of those covenants, of saying that China was part of this agreement or Russia was part of this agreement, and now they are backtracking, they are revoking, they're rewriting history in that sense. And where I think this kind of intersects for me as far as politically, I think part of your question about what can be done. I think that there's real importance in focusing on the investment and the support of democratizations in China and in Russia. That is directly linked to the possibility of peace or justice as we would consider. This is why that I think the movement in Hong Kong in a lot of ways is so important globally, right? Is that the people fighting for self-determination in a way that is reflective of the desire of a government that is responsive to what their demands and what they want. And this is, I think, why I think Dr. Vincent talked about Russia and the protest movement in Russia being so important, is that that's a key, right? That it is not really possible in this in this current set of circumstances to conceive peace and justice without Russia being
a big
in
part
some
of
way a representative and democratic regime.
Yep.
And so I think the hope is that in some way the economic sanctions, the support of what Michael talked about, the publicity and visibility that is cast on what's happening, it's leading to some kind of a change and a shift in Russia. Yeah. And at the same time, in the short term, while we deal with the humanitarian fallout of what's happening in Ukraine, that we have to invest and continue to support and cultivate the democratic aspirations of not just the people in Ukraine, but equally important, the people in Russia, just like we did in Hong Kong. And so I think that that's kind of where the political moral fight of this moment has to continue to expand and deepen in order to resolve what we see as an unresolvable conflict.
We're also seeing a lot of like a pouring of resources from many different organizations around the world in terms of doctors, medical supplies, ammunitions from Germany. They send a lot of weapons directly to Ukraine, and even an international soldier force, like people just signed up to be to be a soldier and fight the war for Ukraine. So those are very concrete grassroots publicity. Public movement. So we probably see a lot more in the coming weeks of those actions. So I wanted to go to the last questions because of the time. The last question is like right now, the two countries, China and Russia, they're actually saying the same thing. Like you're not a country. You're part of us, and then you should be loyal to us. And what do you think about this? And then what do you most importantly, what do you think about Taiwan and China if Russia succeeds in this invasion? I want Dr. Benson to go first.
Yep. I still recall, and I attended a demonstration in London maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. I forget exact date. I still recall there is a girl holding a banner saying that Ukraine is not Russia. In other words, one of the aspects of the war is how to define the so-called political identity of Ukraine, people in the Ukraine, or even Ukrainians. Just like what Taiwanese has said, Taiwan, of course, is not a part of China, especially the young people or even people who have very strong national identity or even political identity. So, of course, in the perspective of Russia and China, of course, they will not want to see this kind of thing happen, because they want to justify what they are doing, including invasion or even military threatening towards Taiwan. Every day, China sent their military force to threaten the Taiwan Strait areas, and also doing a number of things that triggers the Taiwanese. So in case the Russian invasion of Ukraine would be successful, of course, this would be a demonstration effect to be produced towards China, because they will also copy the same formula in doing with Taiwan, and also they also can win the patriots in China that is actually a ultimate national unification of Taiwan under the hand of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has become a not only national hero, but also not like the enlightened emperor in Qing Dynasty, and his name will be documented in the historic books as a great Persian. Of course, I do believe Xi Jinping want to do that, but based on my observation about the Xi Jinping's character or personality, he looked like a person. He wanted to doing something big, but very limited or weak capacity to do so in execution. So this is a kind of dilemma of, for example, whether some people or top officer in China want to trick Xi Jinping to doing something aggressive, try to praise him in this way. As a result, Xi Jinping may make wrong decision. Yeah. So still looking back when I was studying political science, history, national leader, politicians tend to be rational. But based on my personal experience, observations of so-called politician in Hong Kong, government officer, I would say this is totally wrong. So this is not surprising that people make wrong decision, doing something stupid, and Great Wall will be launched. This is not surprising to me, you know.
Yeah. So what about the rest of the speaker, like Mike? What do you think if this wall turned out to be a successful one? I mean, the invasion. What would you think would happen to China and Taiwan?
Yeah, I think this Taiwan question, I recall when the war started, most of the reporter questions I got was, well, will China follow Russia and do the same thing?
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of backfired.
Okay.
Because the idea was that they would invade Ukraine, take the capital city, and it would look like Afghanistan. Basically, the Taliban marched in and took over, and all the resistance evaporated. But they didn't count on what the resistance they're getting. And I think for China, this posed a dilemma then, because many people thought Beijing has been, Xi Jinping has been kind of aggressive lately in his language towards Taiwan, suggesting that maybe if Taiwan didn't agree to China's terms, then China would act militarily. But I think now this behavior of Ukraine has called that into question. In some ways, China now sees that, well, maybe that won't be the case, that maybe there'll be strong resistance. And they don't just have to march in from Crimea or Belarus. They actually have to cross, I don't know, something like 80 miles of sea to get to Taiwan, to invade it. And then they watch all these sanctions, and then Russia's become a pariah state. And Xi Jinping is getting colored with the same stroke of the brush, that he is too close to Putin. Maybe he gave approval to Putin. And so I think China, which has much more skin in the game, because China has a much larger trade posture in the world, much bigger economy, I think maybe this war give him second thoughts. And it's almost like even if Russia takes over Ukraine, they don't win. There's no win in this for them anymore, because they thought they would go in there and they'd be welcomed by many Russian-speaking people, but nobody seems to like them. Nobody seems to be welcoming them. So if they tried to run Ukraine, maybe they would feel like the United States did in Afghanistan. There's no way out. There's no easy end to this problem. And I don't know, it's many people now think this is giving Beijing second thoughts. But, you know, who knows what's in Xi Jinping's mind. But in any case, there's some cause for second thoughts about trying to follow Putin's example.
Yeah. We have to make it more prominent and send this message to President Xi.
Yeah, like, there you go.
Yeah, like watch what you wish for, right?
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Yeah. So, so what about Samuel? Last but not least, Samuel, what do you think about the relationship between China and Taiwan and in all this?
So I think this is all, I agree with Michael. I think a lot of what some of the parallel, I think that, you know, it's always hard to make direct comparisons. So I think that we have to recognize obviously some of the historical differences and some of the unique history. But I think that I largely, agree with what Michael described, because it has been a really interesting exercise over the last few months to think about, I've been in touch with a lot of Ukrainians, Russian sort of civic society groups, both inside but also in the US and across the world. It is uncanny how much parallel and similarities between what they're doing now and what we have been doing for Hong Kong for the last 3 years, right? In fact, I've become sort of a de facto sort of just a source of, bouncing ideas off person for them, because all of the things that they're asking for as far as sanctions, in fact, we have seen a whole different level of coordination that we have been wanting and asking for globally and across, the world for Hong Kong and for China, that came into existence and came into clarity over just 2 weeks of the EU and the US and UK and other countries stepping up, and even countries in Asia, Japan and other places actually stepping up to coordinate actions in response. We see similar, the Campaign for Hong Kong, where I work and where I lead, we activated immediately to support the humanitarian policies around providing temporary protective status in the US for Ukrainians who are already here, which is exactly what we advocated for Hong Kongers who are here in the US. We sent out, in coordination with 11 different British Hong Kong groups, a letter that looks at opening refugee and visa waivers for Ukrainians entering the UK. Again, there's really a lot of parallels in terms of what I think we have been fighting for Hong Kong that applies directly to Ukraine. What I think we also want to see and want to do is making the messaging clear, right, to the people of Russia and to the people of China, that the hope of our actions and Western sanctions and all these other steps, really the ultimate hope here is that there is a way of investing in the people and their democratic aspiration and their own sense of justice for the suffering that is taking place, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia, as they are now experiencing. Yeah. And I think that's where I think it connects really well to where Hong Kongers are and where Ukrainians are and where people of Russia are, is this fostering of the protests and this rising up of the people in the face of a autocratic authoritarian regime. And so I think that's where I see a real connection here, is that at the end of the day, there is no freeing of Hong Kong or a freeing of Ukraine without a democratizations in China and in Russia. And that's
coming from
kind of
within
longer term, broader context that we're in, and that's why I think that all the discussions and ways that we talk about helping here comes back to those, I think, basic foundation of democratizations of China and Russia.
China, within China and within Russia. Yeah. Is there any way that we can collaborate with Ukraine, with Hong Kongers, to send this message across?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say a couple of things. I think that there is definitely a critical, it's utterly important that we connect our movements against autocratic authoritarian regime. And that's been something that why I think Hong Kong has stood out, because we have always said that this is not just a fight for Hong Kongers. This is about a larger contest or campaign, against the expansion of authoritarian regime. And I think Ukraine marks the other big hotspot that has really unveiled or sort of exposed this kind of tension. So what I think Hong Kongers have done, and I think, Dr. Benson was talking about examples of people actually doing concrete things. It behooves us, I think, for all kinds of reasons to connect politically, philosophically, morally, the fate of Ukraine and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I would even say, I will reframe it to say that the fate of the mass majority of people who live under these regimes in China and in Russia, because I think that's ultimately is what we have to what that would provide in terms of avenue to resolving both the war in Ukraine and I think the crackdown and the repression in Taiwan and in Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang, is that we have to foster this democratic aspiration and self-determinations of the people of Russia and China, not just on the sort of
outside,
not just on the immediate concerns of the people in Ukraine and Hong Kong.
Okay, yeah. So so any next steps, small or big, Dr. Vincent and Mike suggest us to do, like in terms of fight back and stop the war?
Maybe I want to address a question raised by an audience from YouTube,
Sure.
which is about is there any chance of revolution from elite groups? Because the anti-war protests in Russia did not do much. The big problem is, it's also a movement theory. We do have a theory called political opportunities. In other words, if there may be a chance of regime change, one necessary condition is that there is a very obvious, clear anti-government leader emerged to lead other elite to, we say, turn over the table of the current regime, so that power change is to be possible. But unfortunately, in Russia, I don't see, or we cannot observe any leader who is able to form their own power base and then need other elite to say no, even cut off with Putin, so that Putin to be overthrown as a result. Maybe I'm able to address this question from that audience.
Mike?
Yeah, well, I'll just comment something that's dear to my heart and why I'm also on the board of Samuel's campaign for Hong Kong, I would like to see, I think as a community, Hong Kongers, and I count myself as one of them since I spent most of my life in Hong Kong, I'd like to see less fracture and more unity. I think within the Hong Kong community, there is a lot of fracture, and I don't feel bad. Don't beat yourself up about it, because this is what happens in exile. In exile groups, the Tibetans have struggled with this problem. The Uyghurs, many other exile groups struggle with coming together, and there's a few people here and a few people there that stand out, and other people feel left on the sidelines, and resentments develop and competition develops. But I think whenever there's a question of confrontation with another Hong Kong exile group, the answer is figure out how to get along. And I think then you can, if you get along among yourselves, then you can get along with the other groups like the Tibetans, the Ukrainians. You'll have a culture of magnanimity, of working together on issues. So that would be my advice. And then I think when you do that, there's a lot of opportunity for solidarity and bringing about that publicity that I was saying is so central to human rights work and political change.
I agree. I cannot agree more. So in closing, yeah, I think it's time, and we run a little bit over. Thank you so much for all of you guys' contributions, participations on the panel discussion. It's really informative, and I learned a lot from you guys today, and I hope the audience feel the same too. And if the situation in Ukraine has changed, we hope to bring you guys back to the panel and talk to us again. So let's hope for the best for Ukraine and for Hong Kong and for Taiwan as well. Thank you so much. And then
Thank you.
we have to adjourn here. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.